Into the Known Universe, a cosmic love story, kinda. Part 2, Love, Death, and Crabs. Chapter 3. Stuart crouched at the bottom of a muddy trench, sweat surging from every pore. The combat fatigues layered under his blast armor were soaked, and his hands were cold and clammy. The mood in the trench was tense, as it usually was before a suicide run. He clutched his standard-issue laser rifle and adjusted his dented combat helmet. The visor's HUD interfaced with his glasses and displayed everything from a proximity sensor to his heart rate, which was soaring like a golden eagle with a ballistic missile lodged in its butt. He fidgeted with his metal collar and looked up at Janna, who was perched at the top of the trench, her rifle slung over her shoulders. "Here they come!" she called, tossing a pair of macro goggles down to the nearest Marine. "God, I love the smell of crab cakes in the morning." "Get down!" Stuart hissed. "They'll see you!" Janna laughed and whistled down the trench. "Crabs inbound! They'll be at the ridge in 2 minutes!" Unlike Stuart, who had done nothing to personalize his armor or weaponry since being forcibly enlisted in the Volunteer Marine Corps, Janna had ornamented her entire combat kit. Her breastplate had a giant target spray painted on it, and her shoulder spalders bore stickers that read, "Born to Die" and "Make War, Not Love," and she had swapped her helmet for a bright red Rambo-style bandana that trailed halfway down her back. The stock of her heavily augmented laser rifle was etched with the phrase, "Clawcracker." She had taken to being a volunteer Marine with the same level of verve as she'd taken to being a pirate cook and bartender. Behind the trench, a trio of officers of indeterminate rank leered at the Marines huddled below them, smoking and drinking coffee. Like all the officers, they lacked collars and were clad in slightly less filthy uniforms and armor. They had the insouciant air of a crew of unionized construction workers who were winding down the clock until their next 2-hour coffee break. "Plump little piggies lining up for the butcher," one of the officers sneered, flicking his cigarette butt at Stuart. "Don't worry, piggies. We'll keep your body bags warm for you." Stuart despised the officers. They were the only ones who'd actually volunteered to be there. Somewhere behind them, a siren wailed, signaling everyone to prepare to vacate the trench. Sergeant Zane, the Homo sapiens Canis Dirus hybrid whom Stuart had first met on the dropship, strode down the line. He'd exchanged one of his arms for a cybernetic one and covered one of his eyes with a patch since they'd arrived on Kokruitki, the crab homeworld. The arm had been lost in a disastrous skirmish with the crabs about a month back, but the eye underneath the patch was still perfectly functional. Sergeant Zane was adamant that having an eye patch enhanced his battle-hardened visage. He was the only officer who partook in suicide runs alongside the Marines, but Stuart knew this was hardly motivated by a sense of solidarity with the grunts. The wolfish sergeant only joined them because he was pants-crapping insane. "Clench up, you flabby-assed sallies!" Sergeant Zane roared over the wailing siren and the rumble of assault vehicle engines. "Remember, the only good crab is a steamed crab." As the siren grew louder, a beam of green light shot skyward from a distant signal tower, rising high over HQ far behind the trench line. All the Marines' collars began vibrating, impelling them to spill onto the outlying plain. "Move!" Zane bellowed, vaulting out of the trench after his regiment. "Move, move, move!" Janna let loose a war cry and charged across the plain ahead of her fellow press-ganged Marines. Stuart scrambled after her and cursed. The damn girl was always the first out of the trench. From what little he'd seen of it, Kokruitki was an ugly little mudball of a world that was dominated by dirt, mud, clay, rocks, cliffs, and the sort of lopsided plateaus that provided somewhat decent views of all the dirt, mud, clay, rocks, and cliffs. Apparently it never rained on Kokruitki, but everything was perpetually wet anyway, courtesy of a network of subterranean springs that seeped water up to the surface, generating puddles and sloughs. The air was always chilly, and the odd stump poking through the mud was all that remained of the world's vegetation, most of which had been blown away by artillery or trampled by the indigenous crabs. Together, he and Janna had survived 2 months on the filthy little world as members of the Volunteer Marine Corps, which had been formed back when people still voluntarily enlisted to serve in the Kokruitki Crab Wars. The ongoing series of wars constituted one of those doomed military campaigns that had seemed like a good idea at the time, but had since fallen out of public favor, especially since the government officials responsible for launching it had all gone to prison for war crimes. Even so, the general consensus was that the only practical way to end the war was to win it. After all, everyone had been fighting for so long that it would be embarrassing to quit now. Besides, doing so would probably result in trench warfare being given a bad name. Criticism of the war was virtually impossible because no one knew exactly who was running it anymore, so there was no one to direct specific criticisms to. However, those who criticized it too loudly often woke up to find themselves on the front lines, where fresh troops were always desperately needed. To bolster the Marines' ranks, which dwindled considerably after every devastating skirmish, the Corps had resorted to employing recruiters to collect conscripts from across the stars and bring them to Kokruitki to help win the fight. One such recruiter had happened upon Stuart and Janna in Valhalla Point's Refuse Bay. The collars prevented the volunteers from going AWOL, or opting out of life on their own terms, and they were tethered in pairs to encourage forced accountability. If one partner strayed too far from the other, or the signal tower at the center of HQ, both collars blew. The result was the same if one partner died in the line of duty, the rationale being that anyone who couldn't keep their partner alive probably shouldn't be entrusted with another. It went without saying that retreating was also a mind-blowing offense. Without the collars, Stuart might have been content to let Janna kill herself in an act of idiotic frontline bravado, but since her death would directly cause his own, most of his energy over the past 2 months had been devoted to keeping her from becoming crab chow. Not that he should have worried too much. She possessed an apparent extrasensory knack for sidestepping death with all the obliviousness of a baby crawling safely across moving I-beams in a construction yard. Janna led the charge, whooping and firing her rifle at nothing in particular. Stuart followed as fast as he could, keeping his head low and trying to avoid being trampled by his fellow Marines or offed by friendly fire, which was rampant in their regiment. Laser bolts from rifles whizzed past him, while plasma shells from distant mortars pierced the sky like molten rocks from a volcano. He wasn't paying much attention to the laser fire. He was too preoccupied with what it was directed at. Beyond the low ridge at the end of the muddy plain, hundreds of crabs were charging straight at them. Even from a distance, he could see them hurtling impact craters and burned-out assault vehicles with ease. Even worse, he could hear their banshee-like screeches, which could easily be described as nightmare fuel. In fact, everything about them would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his natural life, which he didn't foresee lasting much longer. The crabs of Kokruitki were giant, misshapen things that looked like they'd been cooked up in Paul Verhoeven's subconscious after some bad seafood. Their carapaces were green with yellow highlights and covered in spines and knotted bumps. Their bodies ranged from 10 to 15 feet in diameter, and their legs were between 18 and 30 feet long. They had no discernible heads or anything resembling eyes, only flailing antennae and feelers situated across their armored shells. The number of legs and claws varied from crab to crab. Some of the smaller ones sported as little as 5 legs and 3 claws, while the largest Stuart had ever seen had 11 legs and 5 claws. The spacing of the legs and claws was disproportionate, but this did not impede their terrifying speed and agility. Beneath each crab's disc-shaped body lurked a sphincter-like mouth lined with billowing membranes and crunching mandibles. Stuart had often seen crabs feed on Marines both living and dead, a dreadful spectacle that compelled him to reminisce fondly on the relatively minor horror of having been expelled into space. To date, no amount of anthropological research had been able to determine whether the crabs possessed individual intelligences or were controlled by a hive mind, only that they tasted divine when dipped in butter. Stuart trailed behind the rest of the platoon, torn between wanting to keep Janna alive and not wanting to get speared by a crab leg. She was nearly 15 yards ahead of him, sprinting like a child across a parking lot toward a Chuck E. Cheese. His collar was beginning to beep. He was too far from her and in danger of losing his head. "Janna!" he shouted like a parent with no intention of setting foot inside a Chuck E. Cheese. "Wait!" Janna dug her heels in at the top of the ridge and unleashed a burst of laser fire into the ravine below. To his horror, Stuart saw that she was blowing into a horn-shaped crab call, a sophisticated instrument the Volunteer Marine Corps used to draw crabs into battle, which was roughly equivalent to a big game hunter attempting to lure a lion across the savannah by ringing a dinner bell. He sprinted for her and called her name again. She turned and gave him a mock 2-fingered salute, which was the moment the crabs crested the ridge. Several Marines near him dropped their rifles and fled back to the trench. Their collars' green lights turned bright red, flashed for several seconds, then exploded, in some cases eliminating the partner who had remained faithful to the advance. The crabs met the wall of soldiers, and the massacre began. It was much like the massacre from the day before, and the day before that. The crabs broke the line and swept through the troops, unfazed by the onslaught of laser fire. Hundreds of Marines fell in those first few seconds, continuing the 2-month-long trend that Stuart had been observing. Those who survived scattered across the plain in every direction, with those scattering a little too close to the trench blowing their stacks, and many of the rest falling victim to pincers and legs. Stuart dove into a puddle and rolled out of the path of a jabbing leg with microseconds to spare. The 7-legged crab above him reared up and screeched, whereupon a plasma shell blew off 3 of its legs and 2 claws. The mutilated crustacean dragged itself across the plain with its 4 remaining legs, slicing and dicing every Marine in its path. Another plasma shell exploded nearby, reducing Stuart's hearing to a dull ringing. He gasped and cupped his ears with his hands as everything around him slowed and blurred. To his right, he spotted a group of Marines who'd somehow managed to light themselves on fire. To his left, a shell-shocked Marine bent over and picked up his severed arm, only to be scooped up by a crab and devoured. Another Marine ran up to Stuart, seized him by the collar, and started shouting something that sounded like tinnitus. The muted shouting soon turned to screaming, and the screaming quickly became hysterical laughter. When another crab barreled by, the Marine fled, stripping off his armor and clothing with every step. Stuart looked away as the naked Marine pulled the pin on a grenade and tried swallowing it whole, laughing all the while. Soon, the world returned to normal, and the ringing faded, so he was able to hear the horrified screaming and wailing and cussing and shouting and pleading and screeching and blasting in full surround sound once again. "I don't know, but I've been told crab meat tastes good hot or cold." Sergeant Zane sprinted past him, singing at the top of his lungs and firing his rifle at anything that moved, crab or Marine. "I don't know, but it's been said crab meat tastes fine live or dead." Once Sergeant Zane was a safe distance away, Stuart, half-coated in crab meat, stood and half-ran, half-stumbled toward Janna, who was still firing into the ravine. Though he didn't dare stop for fear that she'd jump down from the ridge and keep running, he couldn't resist glancing back to see how badly they were faring. A dozen or so meters past the marauding crabs, he spotted a company of mobile assault vehicles cruising across the plain, hood-mounted rotary gun turrets blazing. The crabs, who reacted to the turret fire like a rhinoceros would a barrage of paintballs, fell upon the assault vehicles as easily as the Marines, flipping and hurling them across the plain. Far behind the trench, dozens of heavy cannons fired concentrated beams of solid energy at the oncoming crabs, which proved slightly more effective than the turrets and rifles. When the beams actually hit their targets, that is. More than a few mobile assault vehicles and entire platoons were liquefied by friendly fire with every blast. With the advance decimated, the crabs spread out across the plain, picking off survivors and ripping open assault vehicles like candy wrappers. All things considered, the Marines were doing better than the day before. By the time Stuart reached Janna, another wave of crabs was approaching the ridge. "That all you got?" Janna called into the ravine. "I've seen bigger crabs in my..." Stuart tackled her to the ground as a gargantuan 15-legged crab hoisted itself out of the ravine, followed by an army of smaller ones. Stuart held Janna down as the apex crustacean lurched over them and across the plain with mechanical precision, shrugging off the fire from an oncoming formation of assault vehicles, only some of which didn't immediately reverse course and speed off. Forcing himself to look up, Stuart witnessed the crab scuttle towards Sergeant Zane, who had his back turned as he laid suppressing fire over the plain. Had he not insisted on wearing an eye patch he didn't need, he might have detected the crab in his peripheral vision and dodged its swooping pincer attack. The crab snatched Sergeant Zane and stuffed him screaming into its mouth, his rifle and eye patch falling to the ground mere feet from Stuart and Janna. A more competent military leader might have possessed the wherewithal to pull the pins on a few grenades before being eaten alive, but Sergeant Zane had always professed a dislike for grenades, decrying them as cowardly and impersonal. And so, the king-sized crab continued across the plain, spearing Marines, assault vehicles, and even smaller crabs that got in its way. Behind the trench, the heavy cannons continued firing, occasionally hitting their targets. While Stuart held Janna down, a pair of blood-splattered Marines came crawling through the mud toward them, rifles clutched in their trembling hands. "What do we do?" one of the Marines shouted. "Why are you asking us?" Stuart shouted back. "Well, I can't very well ask him, can I?" the Marine said, pointing at Sergeant Zane's eye patch. Across the plain, the screeching of the crabs reached a cacophonous crescendo. High above them, a squadron of assault ships soared past, firing missiles and unleashing streams of incendiary red liquid known to the Corps as dipping souse. The dipping souse ignited and spread across the plain like wildfire, consuming crabs and surviving Marines alike. Most of the crabs fled the battlefield, retreating to the ravine or into the southern sloughs. Those that didn't, including the 15-legged freak that had made an appetizer of Sergeant Zane, were blown apart by another barrage of purple plasma blasts. Once the plasma shelling ceased, Stuart looked down at Janna, who smiled at him like she had lost her mind. He blushed at the realization that he was lying on top of her, but was too petrified to roll off. "War is hell," she said with mock huskiness. "A hell of a lot of fun." Thank you for listening to this excerpt from Into the Known Universe, a cosmic love story, kinda. It's my debut novel, and it's available for purchase now from the Friesen Press bookstore, Amazon, Indigo, Barnes & Noble, as well as Apple Books, Kindle, Google Play, Kobo, and Nook. I'm James R.D. Hilton, and if you like what you heard here today, be sure to drop me a line on Instagram and Facebook. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to leave me reviews on Amazon or wherever you buy your books, and keep on reading.